What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to my series going through the 1980s, and now we are at 1981. This was a series that was initially thought of in part by my patrons, so if you guys want to join in the fun with my patrons, help support this channel, and also once a month help give me some ideas for a cool exclusive video, please check out my Patreon link down below. But we are going to be talking about another year in the 80s full of some of the most iconic films ever made. And this goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. If one of your favorite films does not end up on my list, please don't get offended. One of two things happened. Either I have not seen that film yet, or it's just not good enough to make my personal top 10. If it's on yours, please put it down in the comment section below. One other thing I want to state, because there was about 5 or 6 comments saying the same thing in the first video of 1980, I'm going off of US release dates, guys. So movies like Mad Max in the last video was not released in 1979 in the US. It was released in 1980, similar to The Road Warrior, which was released in 1981 in Australia, but was released in 1982 in the US. So you will definitely see The Road Warrior in the next video. And with all of that being said, let's go ahead and kick this thing off with number 10, and this is a little slasher film that was forgotten called The Burning. This is one of the few slasher films of the 80s that is fairly iconic for various reasons, but never really turned into a franchise. And I honestly think it's just because of the killer. I think because Cropsey is not a villain that really transcended through the movie and became a pop culture icon like so many other characters in the 80s like Freddy and Jason. But even with this being a one and done, it is still a fairly popular camp slasher movie. I would say this one, alongside Sleepaway Camp and of course the Friday the 13th movies, are the ones that you will hear about the most when you're talking about camp slashers of the 80s. And what I like about The Burning is that it feels a little bit meaner. It feels a little bit darker. It's not necessarily played for laughs. It's not necessarily played for the goofiness like the way the Sleepaway Camp movies are. It takes itself fairly seriously and has some really dark and gnarly kills by the awesome Tom Savini. If you have not seen this film, or if you have not heard of the raft scene, even if you don't want to check out The Burning, you just want to check out one of the greatest kill scenes ever from the 80s, really ever of all time, look no further than this crazy ass shit. So while it's obviously not one of the best of the genre, it's not one of the best of the 80s overall, and it is one of those movies where unless you're a hardcore horror fan, you probably have never heard of it before, but it's always been one of those films that I look back on and I always enjoy more aspects of it than I don't, and it's one of those movies that I actually think is more than prime for a modern remake. Coming in at number 9 is going to be Friday the 13th Part 2. Now, this is a movie that admittedly is not a gigantic favorite of mine. None of the Friday the 13th movies really are, but this is one of those movies that I will remember 1981 for, because I think this is a significant improvement over the first Friday the 13th film and kind of set the template for where the better films in this franchise went. And so you get the introduction of Jason here. He's the sackhead Jason with the one little peephole and the hillbilly outfit with the pitchfork, and a bit of a divisive look for Jason. Some people love him, some people hate him. I like the sackhead look much more in the remake, I'll just say that. But you got some really good kills in here. The backwards little hook to the face and the wheelchair guy going backwards down the stairs in the lightning storm. Arguably the best kill in this entire franchise, certainly in the conversation. I think that Jenny, the final girl in this one, again, arguably the best in the franchise, certainly in the conversation. The whole thing adding to the lore of the mental manipulation of Jason and how he is still controlled by his mother to where all he needs to see is her sweater and suddenly he's in like a trance and listening to Jenny until he eventually peers over and sees her decapitated head and he's like, oh fuck, that's mom. Characters still really aren't much to write home about outside of Jenny, and there's better films in the Friday the 13th franchise, but Friday the 13th Part 2 is one in the franchise that I don't mind rewatching. Number 8, we're moving over to body horror with Scanners, one of the best and most iconic David Cronenberg films. And the worst thing that you could say about Scanners is that it blows its load extremely early. Literally. Arguably the greatest head explosion ever put to film. I mean, it's one of those scenes that I could imagine everybody in the 80s just pausing their VCR and going frame by frame and trying to figure out how the fuck did he do that? But beyond that gnarly ass scene, you have a really cool sci-fi horror setup to where certain men and women are born with these psychic abilities, these telepathic abilities, and they're known as scanners, and there's a rogue group of scanners that is essentially trying to create like a master race and take over the world because of their superpowers, and they're led by Michael Ironside. And so you got Michael Ironside trying to essentially take over the world with his rogue group, and then you have the government that dispatches this other scanner, a good scanner, to try to battle him and his group. They find out they're brothers. There's all kinds of crazy stuff going on with that. And so if you like sci-fi stuff, if you like kind of the more body horror aspects, the kind of weird, unnerving side of sci-fi that Cronenberg always brings, this is one of the more stylish movies that he has come out with. Number 7 is going to be The Howling. I think most people would agree this is top 2, top 3 werewolf films of all time. Some people would even say it's their favorite of all time. Came out around the same exact time as American Werewolf in London, which is not on this list yet. And so you essentially have American Werewolf in London and The Howling that for all of movie history has been battling it out for who has the better werewolf transformation. I would give that trophy to American Werewolf in London, but the werewolf transformation that we get in The Howling is fucking awesome. Really cool storyline. You get Dee Wallace that is stalked by this guy, and she plays a part into getting him killed and eventually goes to this little getaway island, this little secluded island to get away from it all after this traumatic experience. And it turns out the island is basically an entire haven of werewolves. And it's just a really neat story, the way that it unfolds. A lot of really cool practical effects, some really memorable characters. And by the end of it, you know, it's one of those movies that has a bit of a downer ending that actually really makes the movie better. Sometimes a downer ending can leave you with a sour taste, and sometimes a downer ending can just hammer home the point of the movie, and this is one of them. So, one of my favorite werewolf movies for sure. Number 6, one of, if not the funniest comedy to come out of the 80s, and that is Porkies. I'll tell you what, man, Bob Clark, for a guy that doesn't have like this vast filmography, he created 3 of the most iconic films ever in A Christmas Story, Black Christmas, and Porkies. And this is kind of like a prototype for what eventually became American Pie and a lot of the comedies of the late 90s, early 2000s. And it can hold up with all of those, even though it's decades earlier with the amount of raunch that is in it. You got a group of horny high schoolers that are trying to find any way they can to lose their virginity. And it's like all these different little hijinks of boys will be boys, essentially. And they end up having this little bit of a battle of wills with this local nightclub owner, Porky. And that kind of creates the conflict of the movie to where he steals all their money, embarrasses them in front of everybody, and the whole movie they're trying to get back at him, culminated in a third act where they actually do get back at him. And so there's so many memorable sequences here with, you got Kim Cattrall and her little wolf howling thing that they kind of set up throughout the movie as a running gag and then pay it off wonderfully. You got the shower scene where they're peeking through the eye holes. Certainly some humor that would not play very well today, but we can look back on it and say, remember how we used to be. Probably the funniest sequence in the whole movie to me is where they're off in this little secluded cabin thinking that they're all gonna take their turns with this prostitute, which is pretty fucking disgusting. And they have this whole prank where a guy with a machete comes out. I mean, it's just one of those laugh out loud comedies that I think ages wonderfully. There's so many comedies in the 80s that I have watched later on in life trying to catch up with some of the classics that I don't think the humor holds up or ages very well. Porky's is one of those movies where I think it's as funny today as it was in 1981. Coming in at number 5 is going to be Halloween 2, one of the better movies in the Halloween franchise to me. You know, it's essentially a Friday the 13th movie with Michael in it. I've said this so many times. Halloween came out and inspired Friday the 13th to essentially rip it off, and then the success of Friday the 13th made Halloween be inspired by that and kind of taking away characters and story and just really ramping up the kills and the gore. And I think it's an interesting film. It's an interesting film to pair with the 1978 original because I think this one stylistically and visually has the most in common with that original film. And I think Michael is a pretty good physical performance here by Dick Warlock. Of course, it's the same mask, just looks a little bit different, but one of the better looks of Michael, which it's a shame that how many times in this franchise Michael just looks like absolute ass. Laurie Strode being relegated to a hospital bed, disappointing, not a very good script to be honest with you. Even John Carpenter continues to rag on his job that he did in this film. He essentially wrote this script so that he can get the ability to make The Fog and Escape from New York. And aside from that, the sister storyline, the whole sibling angle, never been a big fan of that one either. But where this movie stands out to me and why it's always one of the more memorable Halloween films is 2 reasons. Number 1, the kills are awesome. A lot of really good kills. And number 2 is because the hospital setting, I've always said, is one of the better settings for horror films because hospitals genuinely unnerve me. So this is still one of those kind of more basic, bare bones slashers that I think holds up pretty well. Number 4. Woo! American Werewolf in London, baby. I still need to review this film. We're gonna do some vampire and werewolf shit in 2023. You mark my words, it's happening. So American Werewolf in London, I think, is probably the most popular answer for greatest werewolf movie of all time. It's certainly the most popular answer for greatest werewolf transformation of all time. Rick Baker, just a fucking god. I mean, he won the Academy Award for his work in this movie. The transformation here is just, it's never been topped. It's never even been matched. There's movies that have so many more decades of advancement in technology and knowledge of the art of makeup effects that can't come anywhere close to how amazing the transformation effects are here. But beyond all of that, which is what the movie is most well known for, it's just a really good horror comedy, and it balances both of those things really well. There's some really horrific stuff in here with him seeing this dead friend, and his friend gets more and more deteriorated as the movie goes on, and some really bloody kills. And then you also have the comedy side of things, which I think is actually really sharply written and really witty, and it's a movie that constantly keeps you on your toes, where you don't know if you should be nervous or scared or tense, or you should be laughing and getting ready for a bigger laugh. And you know, John Landis just found the perfect mix for this film, to where I don't think any other horror comedy has really reached that perfect mix that this film achieves. So it's one of those movies where werewolves have not had near the amount of classics, like all-time great classics like vampires had, but if there is a list of them, this one is likely at the top of that list. Number 3 is going to be the original The Evil Dead, and over time this has grown to be one of my favorites of this franchise. I'm one of the few people out there that actually am not a gigantic fan of Evil Dead 2. When I watch Evil Dead, I like it to be mostly horror or mostly comedy, and so this one I think leans into the mostly horror side. There's certainly some goofy, some slapstick stuff with just the low budget and kind of the way that it is aged and in the worst good possible way. But I think that it's a genuinely creepy movie. I think that it has such a low quality to it, that it has that tension, that unnerving feeling of these demonic presences and everything, to where even the really old school like stop motion gore effects still hold up really well. You get a really great physical performance from Bruce Campbell like you get in every single one of these Evil Dead films that he is in. And it's just a really classic Cabin in the Woods movie. This is a movie that kind of set the template for that entire subgenre of horror, and I think that it still holds up pretty damn well. So many things that Sam Raimi was able to do with almost no money that became just an iconic piece of the genre. The little camera going through the woods and the banging the shutters and the way that he did the gore effects and the way that he does these little quick shots that he still does to this day. It was even in Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness. Just stuff that over time I've grown to appreciate and love even more, and so The Evil Dead definitely had to make near the top of this list. Number 2 is a little film called Escape from New York, and I just reviewed this one recently, just a couple of months ago, so if you want all my in-depth thoughts, I'll put a card up here, and I will be continuing my John Carpenter review series here very soon, hopefully next week, kicking it back off with The Thing. Escape from New York is a movie that one of the better action-y movies in John Carpenter's filmography, and it was the film that kind of made Kurt Russell the star that he is today. He was somebody that was always known for more Disney stuff, and then he wanted to break out and do something different, so he teamed up with John Carpenter and created this character of Snake Plissken, who is still one of the more iconic anti-heroes of the 80s, and totally just shifted how everybody viewed Kurt Russell, and then he became the action and thriller and horror superstar that he became throughout the 80s and 90s. And so that alone is worth putting this movie this high on this list, because Kurt Russell is just near and dear to my heart, and this is where we got to the Kurt Russell that I know and love. But just a really cool story, a really cool, simple story that has a ton of style, which is kind of something you could say for just about every one of the great John Carpenter films. You got New York, that is this post-apocalyptic prison where everything is walled off and every piece of shit in America gets sent there, and you know, they lock him up, throw away the key, and forget about him. And the president lands there after a plane crash, and so they send in one of the most badass anti-heroes ever with Snake Plissken to go into the worst part of the country to take out, to bring the president out. And so it just sets it up for a really cool premise with really great set design and production design, and the way that they were able to light everything to where everything is at night, but you can still keep track of everything that's going on while still having that kind of dirty, grimy prison feeling to it. pretty good action scenes too have aged pretty well. The fight scene with the spiked bat and even some of the shooting scenes. Really the only thing that continuously I go to this movie and feel like wasn't as strong as it could have been is just the villain of the Duke. For how badass and iconic the character of Snake Plissken is, I never really felt like they found a villain to match that for him. And so while the Duke is a fine villain, he's the weaker part of the movie for me. But even with that, still one of my favorite movies of the 80s and certainly one of my favorite films in 1981. But of course, number one is Raiders of the Lost Ark, or what are we calling it now? Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark? Fuck that shit. Raiders of the Lost Ark is number one. Indiana Jones, one of probably top 5 most iconic characters of all time. I mean, this is a guy that has transcended generations. He's an action hero, he's an anti-hero, he's kind of a bit of a ladies' man too, he's an adventurer. There's so many layers to this character to where you can think of him as a badass, but he's also a historian and somebody that cares about preserving artifacts, and so he's not necessarily a hero that's out there for self-motivation very much, what makes him very commendable, makes him a little bit of a different character that we typically follow. And beyond all of that, this is a movie that just kind of came out and was a big shot in the arm for adventure films because it was just major action set piece one after another, from just like the opening sequence with the golden idol and the rolling ball, and then you have a ton of shootouts and explosions. You got the fight scene with the plane twirling around, the iconic horror side of this movie where you have the ark that's opened up and the little spirits go around and melt everybody's faces. This was pre-PG-13, so I was watching it. I actually rewatched it this morning, and I was kind of surprised how much blood and gore is in this movie for what was a PG movie back in the day. So I remember growing up, and it's still that way to this day. My son was a big Indiana Jones fan. We got a new movie coming out that people are nervous and yet very excited for. He's a character that every kid, every boy especially, at some point in his life wanted to be Indiana Jones. We wanted to be that character for Halloween. We wanted the hat. We wanted a whip. We wanted to say the lines about snakes. And so he's just one of those movies, one of those characters, one of those franchises that continues to be this timeless classic. And it is my number one film of 1981. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed this, please click over here for a playlist of this entire series, which by the time it's done will be 10 videos. And I'm also gonna put my 2022 new releases up here as well. If you wanna check out my more modern movie reviews, please like and share this video, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of this series coming out throughout the next couple of months. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.